Sounds good. Well, we're really 5 minutes early, but we're going to start 5 minutes early because everyone's here, including the lecturer. And by the way, and I want to invite you all, following this, to a little reception that will be taking place right out in the corridor there. So please, you'll have an opportunity to have some last conversations on this particular day. But right now, it is my pleasure to introduce to you Professor Kathryn Meier to take our global discussion in another direction. Our next and final lecture today will be on the environmental justice for the 21st century. The environment, as we have come to understand in the past 50 years, is a global topic. No matter that it is a daily, mundane part of our lives, our actions affect others who live in remote places and indeed others yet to be born. Kathryn Meier, an assistant professor of history at the University of Scranton, will take us back to the period when slavery was largely eradicated and then forward to connect the progress we have made in environmental sustainability with the progress we have made in human justice. Quite a topic. We hope to learn from her what we might expect given the relationship between human justice and environmental sustainability in the short-term and the long-term future. Professor Meier's field of expertise includes a history of the Civil War, the environment, and the military. There may be even more, we don't know. She earned her Bachelor of Arts degree in English, concentrating on poetry from the University of California at Berkeley, and her master's and doctoral degrees from the University of Virginia, where she studied with some of this nation's leading American historians. She's a great addition to the university's faculty. Please welcome Kathryn Meier.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me all right? All right, great. All right. Oh, I think, Sandra, you might have grabbed the first page of my notes. Wait a second, that's not where it starts. But thank you for the lovely introduction. All right, that's better. Think about the best cup of coffee you've had recently. I have the best cup of coffee of my life every morning when I get up, courtesy of my French press. The beans come from Electric City Roasters, a local roasting company, who specialize in small batches of this improbably delicious fair trade, shade-grown, organic coffee, where 80% of all of the proceeds go directly back to the small farmers from whom it was purchased. Coffee's come a long way as a crop, and for those who can afford to pay $15 or $20 a bag, there's now a way to drink it more sustainably with justice for small farmers. At the very least, when I hear those sustainability labels, as a 19th century historian, I am reminded immediately of the alternative. In the period of history I study, coffee was not so delicious, and worse, its farming led to mass rainforest extinction and sparked a voracious appetite for African slavery in Brazil, causing Brazil to become the last Western country to abolish slavery within its borders. So coffee's sordid tale also has a parallel crop in the country I focus my research on, America, and that crop is cotton, which also led to intense environmental destruction and prolonged African slavery beyond most of the other Western countries in the 19th century. Indeed, I think comparing the stories of these two crops in Brazil and America can help illustrate for us how historically environmental justice and social justice have gone hand in hand. So I want to focus on two questions with you all today that I'd like for us to answer or start to answer. And the first one is, how are destruction of the environment and the oppression of people related in the 19th century? And secondly, how did liberating slaves also liberate environmental consciousness? For our conversation today, we'll look geographically at the Brazilian Atlantic forest and the American South. Both countries harbored budding abolition movements in the early to mid-19th century. Both were beginning to awaken to the environmental destruction that their respective economic pursuits engendered. And neither's budding conservation movements would actually influence the government until after slavery was abolished. Therefore, I see a link between the restoration of environmental justice and human justice. In other words, with economic reinvention comes new opportunities for environmental sustainability and social justice. So that's the plan for today. We're going to look at two phases in answer to these questions. The first phase, destruction, looking at slavery and the land, and the second phase, reinvention, free people and sustainability. So let's begin with the dark side of these concurrent stories, how destruction of the land and the exploitation of enslaved people were considered economically viable, but proved increasingly detrimental to the goals of health, safety, justice, and long-term economic gain. So we'll start with Brazil. Let me tell you a little bit about the Brazilian Atlantic forest because it's now all but extinct. There is only some secondary growth left. None of the primary forest remains. So there's an arrow pointing at sort of the general vicinity of that forest, but I'll describe it for you. It's on the eastern shore of South America, a broad-leafed tropical forest. Part of it originally touching the Amazon. It was about 1 million square kilometers, roughly the size of Egypt. It contained a remarkable number of endemic species or life forms that were peculiar to it and couldn't be found anywhere else on Earth. Depending on the part of the forest you were looking at, it would receive from 1,500 millimeters to 4,000 millimeters of rain per year. So what's that, roughly 5 to 13 feet? Trees rose 35 meters or more in the air, some of them hundreds, and we think perhaps even thousands of years old, because that area of South America was remarkably free of natural disasters. And like I mentioned, the primary Brazilian Atlantic forest is basically extinct today. What's left is only a few patches of secondary growth. And here's a modern picture of the secondary growth that's left of the forest. So very beautiful. I want to walk you through basically the destruction of this forest as humans set foot on it. So we're going to go through a bit of a timeline here. Bear with me, I'm a historian, so I love timelines. So here we go. And of course, since I'm an environmental historian, I start all the way back at the beginning. So with the first humans who set foot on this Brazilian Atlantic rainforest, we start at 9,000 BCE. That's when the first hunter-gatherers showed up, so we think. And hunter-gatherers are classically known as the least destructive of humans when it comes to environment, although we do think this group contributed to the extinction of megafauna and large mammals. Okay, so definitely they had some kind of impact. Basically, from the forest point of view, humans were never exactly a good thing for its longevity. All right, moving forward to 3000 BCE, that's when we saw the first farmers enter into the Atlantic forest. They practiced what we call swidden, which is a kind of slash and burn type of farming. So they would cut down trees, they would burn the trees in order to fell them and then do some farming. But they tended to do controlled burns that would move with the seasons. And their burns didn't affect the organisms below the soil, just above the soil. So it was relatively gentle on the landscape. And it kept the ground remarkably fertile as well. And then I have there also a subsequent group of people, the Tupi, made an appearance somewhere around there, somewhere around that time period. They were a warlike culture and were afraid of the forest. They didn't stray far into the forest. So they tended to do their farming in the same area, intensifying the use of that particular region. But all in all, times weren't so bad for the forest until 1500. So jumping far into the future here, the Portuguese arrived. And the Portuguese were really interested in the beautiful red bark of the trees that they encountered there. And they began to farm the forest for timber and trade it. Now, they used the tupi for local knowledge because the Portuguese were, had their own fears of the forest. And the tupi in turn helped them because the tupi were hoping for a little bit of support in the area of food extraction as well. So they struck up a kind of partnership which ended in a not so good way for the tupi when the Portuguese decided to enslave them, first as sexual curiosities that they brought back to the mainland in Portugal, and eventually as workers in their timber trade. So 1500 was a sort of pivotal year for both the forest and the tupi who lived there. In the 1530s, the Portuguese shifted their extraction around the commodity of sugar. They began to build sugar plantations, and some of you may know sugar has its own sordid history that we're not going to go in today, but sugar requires quite a bit of processing and labor, and therefore requires a lot of people to do it. And at that point, the Portuguese turned to African slavery in order to man their sugar plantations. And ultimately, Brazil would grow to be the #1 sugar producer in the world. So this required more and more slaves to support. Sugar depletes the soil considerably, and in addition, requires a lot of space to man that operation. So more and more of the forest was destroyed in this process as well. But none of this would compare to 1700 to 1800 when the Portuguese developed an interest in mining. Diamond and gold was what they were after, and mining was incredibly destructive to the forest. It led to intense erosion and basically replaced the forest with pockmarked moors. It was an unrecognizable landscape in the areas where mining occurred. They used hydraulic and manual skimming of the forest soils, and as I mentioned, this kind of destruction was worse than all of the centuries combined for the forest. In addition, the Portuguese learned that the Africans that they had been trading for on the west coast, particularly what was known as the Gold Coast, had specialized knowledge about panning for gold. So they began to bring more and more slaves over in order to contribute to that operation as well. Then we get to 1800. Oh, well, I should mention about 2.5 million slaves were brought over in this period, we think, in order to achieve these operations. So quite a few people taken from Africa. And then 1800, what we saw was massive population growth, about 70,000 people in Rio de Janeiro. And as usual with large groups of humans, you have large numbers of diseases. The diseases came over not only with the people, but with their livestock. Microorganisms and insects love to travel with livestock. And the miners in particular had an appetite for beef. So beef cattle was what was being brought over. So this led to a much more hostile environment for everybody who lived in this area. The diseases were, malaria, yellow fever, cholera, etc. And in addition, as you can imagine, more deforestation on behalf of that cattle who needed a place to graze, and the rainforest is not appropriate for grazing, so more forest was cleared for that. However, in this period of around 1800, we also saw a new interest in the forest itself. Some of the Brazilian Portuguese who lived there began to recognize that the forest actually contained curiosities or valuable goods. In particular, I would bring up cinchona bark, which was used for the curing of malaria. So there were several things that they began to notice that were of some benefit, but this made little difference when they hit on coffee. So 1788 to 1888 is the period when coffee dominated the Brazilian economy. Coffee came into being as mining waned. During this period, about 10 million tons of coffee were produced, and about 7,200 square kilometers of primary forest were cleared in order to accommodate this plant. The plant was brought over from Ethiopia and would cause more of a threat to the forest than anything that had come before it. These farmers believed that coffee had to be planted in virgin soil, which is untrue. They also believed that they had to cut down all of the forest canopy in order to grow it, which is not true. In fact, shade-grown coffee is far more palatable. So their practices were very devastating for the forest. In addition, the soil was used up fairly quickly, and they would never return nutrients to the ground. They would simply abandon one plantation and clear the next plantation, leaving the other one exposed for the soil to be whipped away by the winds. Increasingly, the Brazilian Empire became tied to the North American market because, believe it or not, Americans were not very discerning about their coffee and didn't mind the bitter and quite horrible taste of the coffee that the Brazilians were producing at this point. Again, because of their poor farming practices. So America was their major market for their rather disgusting coffee. So Brazilians continue to slash and burn, again, having little knowledge of how to actually grow this crop well and never replacing their soil nutrients. Now in 1826, so in the middle of this time, Brazil did win its independence from Portugal because Portugal was weakened by warfare. And unfortunately, this served to stall the end of slavery because in the mainland of Europe, Brazil, England, France, Spain, were going through an abolitionist period where they were considering getting rid of slavery within the mainland, and Portugal probably would have followed through with that as well. So at this moment when Brazil won independence, it was good for the Brazilian citizens who were European, but not so good for the Africans who lived there because this continued slavery. So throughout the 1800s, large numbers of African slaves were brought in. Indian peoples were continued to be killed off by disease and weapons. And really by 1822, all of the other European countries, besides Portugal, but soon Portugal would follow, had forsworn the international slave trade. So Brazil could have easily begun its identity without the international slave trade, but it refused at first. Finally, in 1831, it said, okay, we will go ahead and end the slave trade. But really, this was not enforced until 1851. So it was allowed to go on for many more years, during which perhaps 1 million more slaves were imported, which was enough to fuel the plantation system for many, many more years. Slavery indeed remained legal within the country. Okay. In 1835, I wanted to include at least one example from amongst the many examples of slave rebellions that were going on during this period. So by no means were the Indians or Africans who were enslaved not raising their voices against this crime against them. The Bahia slave rebellion is just one example. Unsuccessful in 1835. About 200 Africans fought and lost this rebellion. So that's just a reminder to us that indeed enslaved people were raising their voices. Now 1869 to 1888, several influential abolition societies arose calling for an end to slavery. One example is the Humanitarian Society for Abolition. And indeed, the Liberal Party adopted emancipation as part of its political platform. So you start to see some movement toward grassroots doing away with slavery. By the 1870s, so much of the forest had been destroyed because of coffee planting that coffee production was no longer viable. There was really nowhere left to do the kind of clear-cutting, virgin soil planting, shadeless coffee that they were growing at this time. And when those options ran out, further enslaved people continued to resist their bonds. And really, up until this point, the main reason for continuing slavery in the Brazilian government's mind had been coffee. So in the 1870s, you start to get this questioning of, well, without coffee, is there meaning in slavery? Is this something we want to continue to do? And indeed, even slaveholders were becoming ashamed of themselves, and there's some writing to prove this, that being the last country of the Western countries to have slavery remaining within its boundaries was a bit of an embarrassment. So finally, in 1888, Princess Isabel signed the Golden Law, which abolished slavery in Brazil. Environmental collapse meant farming coffee in the old way didn't make enough sense to justify slavery anymore. So this timeline shows exploitation of the forest and enslaved people, and it demonstrates that this was economically profitable for a, I think, stunningly short time, right? Coffee comes about in maybe 1788, and by 1888, they have destroyed the landscape so much that it's no longer economically viable to continue with this. And furthermore, there were grave consequences, even beyond harming Africans and Indians, and causing the extinction of countless species. The accompanying diseases harmed the Brazilian population's health. Their crops were poor. Deforestation and erosion led to droughts, which put farming food in peril and caused hunger. So there were all these kinds of side effects. And furthermore, all of this was in the name of producing really bad coffee that only Americans would drink. And something I sort of alluded to, but I just want to make clear, is that the alliance with slavery put Brazil's international reputation at stake. Brazil wanted to become a part of the intellectual community in Europe, and Europeans were shunning them because of their clinging to slavery and also their refusal to use any sort of scientific management, which was becoming increasingly popular in Europe. So really, this whole operation was very detrimental to Brazil, and it was being looked down on as a second-class country. Now, I want to compare that story to the American South and the cotton crop. So this is going to look very familiar because I think these stories are quite similar. 11,000 BCE, we think, these dates are very tentative, were the earliest documented people who were living in America, the Clovis people. They were hunter-gatherers. And again, by about 9,000 BCE, we saw the extinction of megafauna and large animals. Possibly by them, we think they at least contributed. We also see the development of agriculture. Now we'll go ahead and skip right ahead to 1607, the founding of Virginia. So this was Britain's first colony at Jamestown. They again used local Indian knowledge, the Powhatan Indians, in order to farm food and make some use of a landscape that was foreign to them. But mainly they looked to growing their own wealth in order to compete with Spain, Portugal, France, and the other European giants. 1612 was when they hit upon their first cash crop, and that was, of course, tobacco. Tobacco is extremely destructive to the soil and can only be farmed in the same area for about 3 years without having nutrients replaced. And they did not do any sort of sustainable action to restore the nutrients, and therefore, after about 3 years, they would have to abandon their plantation and move to a new location. So immediately they began ripping up the soil in their pursuit of tobacco. In 1619, we also saw the first African slaves set foot in British America. 20 of these Africans were traded to some of these Jamestown plantations for tobacco use. And that's a whole other story that I won't go into, but I could go on and on about that. So the first Africans arrive in 1619. Now, in 1663, that's when South Carolina was founded. And now we're getting close to where cotton is going to be grown. At first, in South Carolina, British settlers were pouring in from the Barbados. That was a British colony where sugar planting was going on, and there simply wasn't enough room. They were islands, and the people needed another spot in order to grow. And South Carolina looked sort of like Barbados. It had a hot humid environment. So they thought, okay, they picked up their slaves and moved there. At first, they struggled to find a crop, but as it turned out, their African slaves had knowledge of how to grow rice in these flooded areas, and later they grew indigo. So again, slave knowledge and labor was crucial to this operation in growing rice. And some of you may know that South Carolina became the richest colony early on because of rice. But our big star comes in the 1780s. That was the real moneymaker, cotton. Cotton began to be grown in South Carolina and then Georgia as demand for textiles increased in England and New England. This would be the raw material that fueled the first industrial revolution. Cotton needs about 200 days frost-free growing season, so the South was perfect for this crop. And unfortunately, well, sometimes we think that cotton itself is a problem for the soil, that cotton as a crop leaches nutrients. It's actually not the same as tobacco. It was the farming practices that were poor for the soil. They would allow the land to be completely exposed during the winter. And the winter, again, the winds would whip the soil off, carry away the topsoil, and leave the land barren. So that was a poor practice. In addition, cotton does not provide much biomass in order to return nutrients to the soil. So you need to use additional sustainability practices when you farm cotton. They weren't doing that. Instead, they were abandoning their plantations and moving on west. So at first, cotton began in South Carolina and Georgia, but very quickly it began to spread to western areas. Now, I do want to mention that also in that period, we had the American Revolution from 1776 to 1781. And the American Revolution really challenged the idea of slavery. Enlightenment ideas were calling into question the idea of treating people fairly and with justice. So suddenly slavery was under attack during the Revolution. But cotton, much like coffee, revived the desire to keep slavery alive in a time when perhaps it could have been done away with. Okay, so again, we see this crop rear its ugly head. In 1793, Eli Whitney often gets credit for inventing the cotton gin. This is one of my pet peeves. What he actually invented was a form of the cotton gin that could be easily mass-produced. So in 1793, the cotton gin facilitated the production of cotton because cotton is actually very difficult to extract the fiber without a machine. So once this device could be mass-produced and every cotton farmer could have it, this led to intense deforestation that made people's interest in cotton greater than ever. And this led to a demand for more slaves. So 1787 is the year of our Constitution. And the Constitution, again, sparked a debate over, do we want to have slavery in this country? Do we not? Many people thought not because of that Enlightenment thinking. But ultimately, cotton won the day. And we ended up with the Constitution affirming slavery, not with actual words. The word slave is not mentioned in the Constitution. All other persons are mentioned. But indeed, slavery was affirmed in the 3/5 clause, in the fugitive slave law, and in the end of the international slave trade, which we agreed upon for 1808. Okay. So this was, again, a step toward removing slavery, but slavery continued to thrive internally well past 1808. And in fact, we'd have nearly 4 million slaves by the 1850s because America had the largest naturally reproducing body of slaves in the entire world. Okay, so slavery continued to thrive. In no way did the end of the international slave trade harm slavery in this country. 1830s to 50s. This is when cotton really starts to spread west. I mentioned how quickly they were using up the land. And cotton spread from South Carolina and Georgia to Arkansas, Florida, Texas, and then increasingly Louisiana, Alabama, and Mississippi. But at the same time as cotton was spreading, abolition was spreading, particularly in the North. There were a number of societies that sprung up and called into question this. Now, even some of the agricultural societies in the North and South discussed the fact that cotton farming and slavery were unsustainable. And I think this is fascinating. This is new information that historians didn't know before. There was actually a conversation going on between Northerners and Southerners about the unsustainability of the way cotton was being farmed and the use of enslaved people. They believed that one was destroying the land and leaving it barren, and on the other hand, we were destroying the moral fiber of our democratic republic. And one example of a journal that was discussing this was The Southern Cultivator, a dialogue between New Yorkers and Georgians, published in the 1840s. And some of the suggestions for doing away with cotton and slavery together recommended growing wine, fruit, all sorts of other crops that wouldn't require so much labor. So there was definitely a conversation going on. Yet cotton was the leading export and exceeded the dollar value of all other exports combined. So this was too economically viable at this moment for people to give up on. And indeed, 3/4 of our cotton that was exported to Britain. And I'll save the irony of that for another moment. All right, so 1831. Again, I wanted to give you one example of the fact that slaves were speaking up for themselves. Nat Turner's rebellion was an unsuccessful slave rebellion, yet it's just one example from many of people attempting to escape their bonds. Of course, what ultimately ended slavery in this country was civil war, 1861 through 5. It took a war to shatter our nation's reliance on cotton and on slavery. And civil war came when it did because of a debate over if slave labor should be used to farm Western territories. So all of this spreading west sparked this moment when we went to war. Now, during the war, because of Lincoln's blockade of the coast and the Confederacy's need to grow food, cotton became more and more difficult to grow, and we lost the major market for cotton, which was England. So cotton really took a hit from which it would never recover. England began to import cotton from Egypt and India and didn't need the South anymore. So the Civil War basically killed cotton, and in addition, it killed slavery. During the war, it wasn't only Lincoln, the government, generals who were causing emancipation, but the people themselves who were enslaved. Wherever they saw the U.S. Army march, people would run away from plantations and join, link up with the back of the army. They became known as contrabands. So self-emancipation happened during the Civil War, in addition to wartime emancipation. And ultimately, in 1865, we had the 13th Amendment permanently abolishing the institution of slavery. So similarly to Brazil, this story shows that cotton farming with slave labor was economically profitable, for sure, but had serious political, social, and environmental consequences. Slavery ended in this country only with a war that killed 620,000 people. And further, the focus on a monocrop without sustainable practices led to a swath of destruction that marched from the coast of South Carolina all the way across the West, depleting topsoil and causing tremendous land hunger, which also, incidentally, resulted in the killing and removing of Indians in the path. All right, so let's turn to the happier part of this presentation, reinvention, free people sustainability. Reinvention. I think it's apparent in both stories that small groups of people were becoming interested in how agricultural practices were affecting the environment. And concurrently, enslaved people and their abolitionist allies objected to human bondage and helped to bring the institution to an end. But little sustainable action that affected the government was taken while exploitative agricultural practices were culturally viable and economically profitable. So in the latter half of the century in Brazil, several small-scale experiments in reforestation were taking place, and the most famous of them is Manuel Gomes Archer's experiment. This is a very small-scale experiment going on while slavery was still intact. He had a massive property and actually used slave labor to replant trees. He's very famous for doing this, but this was still small scale. He and others were amateurs and were completely ignored by the government bureaucracy. But following abolition, a number of specialized government agencies staffed by scientific professionals were created with the specific job of resource management, which we call conservation. At the turn of the century, Brazil was struggling to reintegrate with Europe, particularly the British intellectual community who had shunned Brazilian slavery and their lack of scientific progress. Now Brazil had no slavery and evidence of scientific management to recommend it to that community. In addition to government conservation agencies, Brazil also invested in studying natural sciences with the Brazilian Acclimatization Association, the Agricultural Institute, and the National Museum. Journalists like Euclides de Cunha drew attention to environmental destruction caused by the coffee plantations and railroads, incidentally, and the middle class rallied to condemn coffee plantations based on his example. 1901 saw the first celebration of Arbor Day in Brazil, and this happened largely because of the efforts of one botanist, Alberto Lofgren, from the Paulista Museum, and he also eventually oversaw the new Forest Service in Brazil. He knew the Atlantic forest could not be replanted, but he made an excellent case among the middle class for conservation and wise use of the forest. So basically, in short, a liberation from slavery coincided with a liberation from the most predatory environmental thinking. A reinvention of economics made room for both social and environmental justice in Brazil. In America, a similar reinvention occurred after the Civil War. Now, the South certainly didn't give up on growing cotton. That didn't happen, unfortunately. And I say unfortunately because cotton never returned to the profitable status it had enjoyed before the war, not even close. And I think cotton is one of the major reasons, a sad clinging to cotton in the South that caused the South to be impoverished well after it should have recovered from the Civil War. So they didn't give up on cotton. But like in Brazil, the period after slavery became the dawning of new national environmental thought that finally took hold at government and popular levels. So it's no coincidence that during the Civil War, on June 30th, 1864, President Lincoln signed a bill granting Yosemite Valley and the Mariposa Grove of giant sequoias to the state of California as an inalienable public trust. And that was the first federal setting aside of scenic lands merely for public enjoyment. This idea was the spark that allowed for Yellowstone to become the first official national park in 1872, and Yosemite itself became a national park in 1890. There's Yosemite in the background. We'll talk about those two guys in a moment here. Really, two strains of environmental thought emerged in America in the late 19th century after slavery was eradicated. The first was conservation, which I mentioned is wise use of resources. And the second is preservation, which means preserving nature as is. Conservation comes from a fear of running out of resources like timber, soil, etc. That happens from overuse and a lack of planning. Now, Gifford Pinchot, whose house is actually just an hour here in Milford, Gray Tower, so you can visit his house. Gifford Pinchot is the man associated, he's kind of referred to as the father of conservation. He became the first chief forester of the U.S. Forest Service in 1905 under Theodore Roosevelt. So that was one strain that took root at the government level. The other strain I mentioned is preservation, and John Muir is often considered the father of preservation. Preservation is linked to the creation of national parks and groups like Sierra Club. Preservationists believe nature has intrinsic value, and the government has a sort of moral obligation to preserve lands. So John Muir is kind of an interesting guy. He was always a nature enthusiast and was actually temporarily blinded in a machinery accident in Indiana, after which he set off on a 1,000-mile walk all the way down to Florida to recover. And while doing this, he had sort of a vision about preserving nature the way it looked for human benefit and also for nature's benefit. He helped create the Sierra Club in 1892 and agitated for Yosemite to become a national park. Now, both Muir and Pinchot lobbied President Theodore Roosevelt for support. And although Theodore Roosevelt did favor conservation on the whole, because he was an outdoors lover himself, he also developed 5 national parks while president from 1901 to 1909. Among those were Crater Lake, Wind Cave, Sully's Hill, Mesa Verde, and Platte. Okay. So, I'll go back to that picture. The identities of these men, as you can probably guess, are Theodore Roosevelt there on the left and John Muir on the right. And this was their trip to Yosemite to sort of look it over as he was trying to convince the government to make Yosemite a national park. So, in conclusion, I think it's worth pointing out that the moments when slavery collapsed in both countries created the opportunity for new relationships to nature. Coffee and cotton are thriving today in more sustainable and higher quality forms. Not to mention, I think both of these countries have made enormous strides in social justice since the 19th century. And going back to my title today, I have to confess something about this. Going back to environmental justice for the 21st century. Now, I have to confess, I didn't actually choose that title. Historians aren't usually in the business of prescribing for the present or the future. I wanted to call this talk something really long and really boring that involved a colon, like all historians do. But thankfully for you, someone intervened and made this gave this a title that you would actually want to attend. So now that I have this title, I feel emboldened to say something that is uncharacteristic for historians and actually talk a little bit about the 21st century. Today I often hear fears about altering business practices in order to make them more sustainable. There's this fear that, businesses will lose money. That's the number one fear I hear. And I think history really teaches us that this is short-sighted. We know that vulnerable people are being hurt right now by poor environmental practices. Classic example is, dumping toxic chemicals in a water source nearby, impoverished people who can't speak up for themselves. So environmental degradation eventually catches up with us and undermines all aspects of human lives. We saw how complex that process was in Brazil and America in the 19th century. So I think in the meantime, 19th century Brazilian and American history should embolden us to act now to enrich democratic ideals in tandem with sustainability. So that's where I'll leave the talk, and now we can talk. Any questions?
More slavery now than there even was in the 19th century.
Give me an example.
They say that there's slavery in Africa that still goes on that we don't know about. Mm-hmm. And of course we have the the people that come from Russia and all those other countries that go to the countries as prostitutes or activities.
Yeah, I'm not sure about, since I'm a 19th century historian, I'm not really well versed in what the type of slavery in Africa going on right now is. This kind of slavery was definitely agriculturally bound, at least the kinds we talked about today. That's not to say that in the 19th century there weren't other types of slavery. There certainly were. In the northern states, there was slavery in all of the colonies before the American Revolution, even though in the northern areas it tended to be more linked to commerce, trade, etc. But certainly in these two stories, the most important aspect is that these two crops created such an insatiable desire for economic profit that that slavery was needed to support them well after they should have been, right? The rest of the European community was raising a moral outcry against slavery. And I mentioned the ironic thing, England, right? England was buying all of our cotton. England was leading the way in abolition. England was the major European country in the 19th century saying, we should do away with slavery for moral reasons, and yet they were buying all of our cotton. So this is more of an agricultural-based slavery. So I'm not sure if I would link modern slavery to environment in quite the same way.
No, I'm not trying to link it with environment as well.
Mm-hmm.
Even like the Chinese that slip into this country
Mm-hmm.
really are under slave conditions. They work many times in our industries, even in the big cities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see your point. So you're saying that in some ways slavery does persist in the Western countries. Definitely, I like to, since I do teach the Civil War, I like to point out that the Civil War did have a major impact on slavery, and that was to make the institution of slavery illegal and to do away with mass slavery forever. So even though conditions remained deplorable for African Americans for many, many years after that, the kind of chattel slavery that our country had largely supported was done away with. So yes, in some ways slavery does persist, but certainly not in this kind of mass violation of human rights.
I understand that Brazil did not have the racial problems that we have had here in America because they intermarried at an early stage.
That's one of the theories. Yeah, there's also a theory linked to Catholicism. So there's several theories that roam around. So of course the British were Protestant, while the Portuguese were more aligned with Catholicism. And there's sort of a historical theory that Catholics were more sort of open, that religion allowed for a more openness with intermarrying. So the intermarrying happened with the Indian populations, with some of the African populations. And that didn't happen so much in the English colonies. And again, the argument is that in a way, the English were the most provincial of all the Europeans. That's how I've heard it said before. That the kind of stark Protestant ethic really caused a kind of fear among the English of interacting with people who were different from them. So there was actually a reluctance to enslave Indians when the English first developed the colonies in America. They had seen the kind of Spanish way of enslaving the Indians because the Spanish had no sort of qualms about it in Mexico, etc. They enslaved them right away. And English actually tried to work with the Indians at first because they had a fear of enslaving them. And also, I would make an argument that they were reluctant to bring African slaves to the colonies because of fear of others as well. Indeed, the English used indentured servants for years until the supply of indentured servants dried up. And then they had to look for another source of labor, and that source was African. But I think that's a really interesting point.
Katie,
Yeah.
12 million Africans were transplanted to the Western Hemisphere, of which we're startled to hear that only about 6 or 7% came to the colonies.
Mm-hmm.
Yet the slavery population flourished here and
Absolutely.
considerably diminished in Mexico, Central America, and South America. Can you expand on that?
Yeah. I don't think we have the answers to this yet. Historians talk about this. I think we're still trying to understand exactly why our slave population flourished so much. One of the things that I would bring up is disease. The colder climate of North America, was less conducive to some of the microorganisms that flourished in Central and South America. So that wasn't as much of a problem for enslaved people and the settlers in general. And the further north you go, the healthier the populations were in the original colonies. So we think that that is maybe one explanation. Another explanation is the way that our plantation system worked. So I'm going to use South Carolina as an example because I was talking about it earlier. Some of the low country plantations were special in that because the disease environments were particularly bad, their plantation owners would leave their slave populations alone for large parts of the year. So indeed, for all of summer and all of fall, literally the Europeans would abandon their plantations and leave the slaves to do the farming while they left to go somewhere healthier. So these populations had minimal oversight. Normally there would be one African enslaved person who would be kind of in charge of the plantation, and there would be one white overseer hired for, let's say, 5 plantations in an area who would sort of wander around and check to make sure everyone was doing what they were supposed to be doing. But this created these kinds of really thriving African American communities, as you can imagine, where your family was there, and you could reproduce naturally, and it was in some ways a more conducive situation to reproduction. That's how I'll leave it. Now that was special. For South Carolina, that was kind of a special situation because of the disease environment. Other areas, we know that perhaps 50% of slave families were pulled apart in some way during the institution of slavery, meaning at least one member of the family would be sold away. So in other ways, it was very destructive to family life. But slave owners encouraged their slaves to reproduce as much as possible. This was highly prized. They hired doctors to look after the reproductive health of their women. A lot of money was invested in keeping slaves healthy so that they could reproduce. And again, this is sort of like the gruesome side of the story, but we think all of those factors are in play. It's very complex, and there's, I think, a lot of explanations there as to why. And I don't really have as much knowledge about, the systems in Spain and Brazil. I don't have that kind of intimate knowledge of how the reproductive health sort of functioned there. But here, a lot was done to keep women having as many children as possible. Other questions?
Yeah, Katie.
Sandra, yeah.
Yeah, just wondering about the environmental movement in
Yeah.
this country and its resurgence or its birth, or certainly its growth in
Yeah.
the past, well, we say 40 years or so, and how are we doing?
How are we doing?
As compared to how we might be doing if we didn't have to.
Yeah, well, I think we're doing better, but certainly not well enough. What we see with, for instance, the Atlantic forest, the reason I chose the Atlantic forest as a comparison is because it is basically extinct. It is basically completely destroyed in a time before we had the kind of technology that we have in the 20th century, which has caused massive environmental collapse. So if we have felled entire rainforests the size of Egypt from this kind of antiquated farming that we were doing with, cotton, coffee, etc., then I think it's very frightening what we can do nowadays. So I think, with this sort of acceleration of our technology, we need to accelerate our environmental movement much more than what was happening back then. So I think, there's a promise in this story. There's sort of a hope that comes in the story that when we have a moment where something happens and we have, this kind of economic disaster, I'll put it that way. There's an economic disaster. What are we going to do about it? Well, I think those are moments when we can look around and say, why don't we change the way we do things? Clearly things were not working before, so let's reinvent our social identity and our environmental identity in that moment. And so here we're talking about civil war, massive civil war, and basically the collapse of a rainforest that caused people to say, okay, what are we going to do about this situation? Let's do away with slavery. Let's change our practices. Let's think about the environment in a different way. And now here we are right now in this country facing an economic crisis. Why not take this moment to sit there and say, how can we enhance our democracy that we're so proud of in this country and reinvent our environmental thinking? Yeah.
In other words, you disagree with Governor Perry?
We won't go there. I think you can probably infer what I think about that. Yeah.
I don't know much about this, but from what little I know, there's this Keystone Pipeline, there's this massive shale oil production in Canada that's doing incredible environmental damage up there, and then they're talking about putting the pipeline in the whole thing in the middle of our country coming out in Texas, and so it sounds like we're doing the same thing that we've always done, which is cave into the interests of commerce, business, and big oil, and not doing anything to curb our own appetites.
But that's the irony, right? Is we think that this is, going to be economically profitable. But that's what these stories teach us, is they're economically viable for a moment in time. And then we experience complete collapse, and they are no longer economically viable. And then not only will no one be making money, who's making the money right now, but far, far worse things. There will be no future for humans. So I think natural gas is absolutely not an answer, and it's the same road. And I think the problem is people don't look at history. People have a very short memory of history, and if we look at things like these two stories, we can see, again, I think we can have hope that actually things get better when you take a moment to reassess the way you do things and to perhaps change.
One thing that has always worried me is, among many, is the export of our industry to China, India, all those countries, for a multitude of reasons. But one of the things that bothers me in this transplant is that when they do open factories in wherever, even though they say they are making an effort to make these factories more humane and more environmental, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, they don't.
Right. Well, that's why we do it.
And of course, that's why we do it, and we let them get away with it. And then we go and buy this stuff.
Yeah, I agree.
And I don't see that it's going to change, because we are doing nothing to these industries to say that's the wrong thing to do, you have to pay to do this. We give them incentives to do this.
Yeah. No, I completely agree with you. And I think, going back to this story, what's captivating to me about the 19th century is that the question of slavery was really a moral question. Now I feel like we boil everything down to economics, to pure, cold, making money. It always comes down to a bottom line. If you want to convince someone to do something sustainable, you have to make the argument that they're going to make more money eventually. That's the only way to convince people to use sustainable practices. At least that's what it seems like, and that's what people seem to argue whenever things are going wrong. In the 19th century, I think it's fascinating to look at the fact that England, well, remember, they were buying all this cotton, so we can only put so much stock in what they had to say. But England really was making a moral argument about slavery. And they were saying that our practices, our environmental practices, our agricultural practices, were causing a moral failing. And they were shunning Brazil, upset with America, and those voices that I talked about throughout the years of reason, cropping up saying, this is not sustainable and we're hurting people, it is hurting our democracy. I would love to see a return of that kind of sentiment. I admire that about the 19th century. I admire that people sort of looked at things in more moral terms and said, what is our democracy about? and how can we work to preserve it? But yeah, I agree with what you're saying. Yeah.
Briefly stand up for England for a moment. The
Stand up for England.
The working classes in all the spinning towns were actually in a lot of solidarity with the North because of the slavery issue. Even when the
Yeah.
cotton started to fail, there was a lot of unemployment in the northern towns. And there's a beautiful statue that the workers put up of Abraham Lincoln if you go into the heart of Manchester city centre. And so it's complicated, but actually it was, as you say, it's a moral issue, not just it was a moral issue, it trumped their own economic self-interest. They felt themselves to be standing with the North against slavery, even though they were in industries that were reliant on the slave product.
And I'm so glad you brought that up
Yeah.
because on one hand, we do economic things, right? We do things in the interest of economics. So England was buying 3/4 of cotton
You can
exports.
still try and stand on a different principle.
Exactly, but there's a principle, there's a moral principle underlying it, and that gives me hope.
Yeah.
That gives me hope that both things can be going on at the same time,
Yeah.
and that eventually the
Well,
thing could be
Abraham Lincoln was a
undone.
hero among the English working classes.
But the gentry of England were supportive of the Confederacy. And
That's right, they wanted the cotton.
England, and also there was the belief that the South was an underdog, and therefore we should be supportive of that. So England came within a hairline of actually, not only because of the cotton industry, but because of its belief in that you had the right to express yourself as a secessionist movement, and therefore we're supportive of it.
Yep. Another thing that occurs to me about the 19th century romance with England and other European nations is the imperialism, the owning and operating other countries and wealth. And that's even larger in a sense, or comparable to owning a slave.
Right.
Because they own people
Absolutely.
in all these countries.
Yeah, and England, has anyone ever been to the gardens at Kew? The Kew Gardens, yeah. So England had its own sort of, I hesitate to use the word environmentalist back at that time because it was, it's anachronistic. But they had their own sort of environmentalist initiatives, right? They had developed this kind of tropical gardens. They were really interested in conserving some of the wonders they saw from within their tropical, colonies. So they definitely saw the environmental benefits, but at the same time were colonizers. There's
And
always
devastators of their own landscape.
Yes, absolutely. Yep. JC, a hand? Yes.
Given your title versus a lot of the two stories covered,
Remember, I didn't do the title.
No, that's okay, but that's a take advantage of it anyway. In your study of those two processes, what have you uncovered any point where there was sort of a clear alternative path that could have been taken? In other words, is there some critical moment in either case that might be some guide for some of the things you're hoping we'll do now?
That's a really good question. And this is a new research project for me. So I think that's what I'm hoping to find. It really is what I'm hoping to find. So I focus on America, and my new research project that I'm hoping will pan out along these lines is during the Civil War, General Sherman, when he was marching to the sea, a number of enslaved people attached themselves to his army. Like I said, happened. Self-emancipation. These people were contrabands. He didn't know what to do with them. Thousands and thousands of these humans were attaching themselves to the army, literally just wandering, and Sherman had to feed them, he had to clothe them, he had to house them, and he said, for heaven's sakes, what am I going to do with these people? So what he actually did under Special Order 15 was to confiscate land on the South Carolina seacoast from some of the plantation owners there and settle these thousands of people there and allowed them to farm land. He said, this is your land, do with it as you will. And these people really believed in that moment that they were going to keep that land. ultimately was taken away from them by Andrew Johnson in Reconstruction. But I really want to know how they farmed when they were there. So this is my new research project. I want to know the people who are actually enslaved, given this moment of reinvention of themselves, what kind of farming practices did they use? So the answer to your question is, I don't have an answer to that yet. I'm really hoping that I find something when I really start to dig into this, and I'm really interested in doing it through the perspective of the people who are most hurt by these two processes. But we'll see. I think that just in a general sense, it's important for us to look at these two periods as economic reinvention, and just to say that if America and Brazil did this before, if we reinvented ourselves in these major ways before, we can do it again. How to do it? I don't know, that's someone else's job to figure out. Not the historian's job, thank goodness. But, yeah.
More questions, or is that thanks, good night?
Good.
Well, thank you. I hope that you didn't mind being given or having your title tweaked. And
No, I liked it, as I said. It gave me a chance to do something historians don't normally get to do.
Yeah.
So.
Thank you so much. And again, join us in the corridor for a little